We are going to talk about the locomotor system. So basically the lecture has two parts. The first one will cover the skeletal system, so the bones and the joints. The general function of the bones. So first of all, the body parts require a solid basis on which you can put the other parts like the muscles and nerves and organs hung onto this framework basically. So that's the function of the skeletal system of the bones. So this means that it supports the body. It also supports the movements. The bones and joints are the so-called passive locomotion organs. So these are the ones which are passively moved by the active components, which are the muscles. In several areas of the body, the bones provide protection of the organs as well. So there is a cage or a cavity which surrounds the soft organs, like you have the skull for the brain, you have the rib cage in the chest to protect the heart and the lungs. In some cases, this is also extremely important because it can influence the organ function, not just passive protection. You also have the red bone marrow inside some of your bones, which is responsible for blood production, so produces blood cells, the red, white, and platelets as well. If we characterize the bones and classify them, divide into groups, then there are several possible divisions. In different textbooks, different classifications can be found. This classification is basically taking all of the different aspects into consideration. So this is, generally speaking, a synthesis of all different characterization methods. So first of all, you can have tubular bones which have an elongated shape. These can be long or short bones. In some cases, the tubular shape of the bone is not that obvious. Flat bones like the scapula, the hip bone, and most of the bones of the top of the skull. You also have bones which are containing a cavity filled with air, so air-containing cells are inside the bones. Such are called pneumatic bones. A lot of such bones can be found in the facial skull in order to reduce weight and other functions. We will cover these later. There are also cuboidal bones like the wrist, the ankle, and the vertebral bodies are basically cuboidal bones. So this is how you can classify bones according to their shape. If you are talking about tubular bones, long and short, basically you have the three main parts which can be found there. So first of all, you have two end pieces, a proximal end piece and a distal end piece. So the proximal one is closer to the origin of the limb, like shoulder or hip, and the distal one is closer to the end, so the hand or the foot. And then you have a mid piece or shaft, which is called diaphysis in Latin, whereas the end pieces are called epiphyses in Latin. So this both can be applied to a long bone like the bone of the upper arm, or the bones of the hand like the metacarpal or phalangeal bones. However, in these cases you use specific terms like base, body, and head, but it is actually proximal, distal, epiphysis, and diaphysis in its own right. You also have inside the bones a medullary cavity which is containing bone marrow. The bones are encapsulated into a periosteum layer, which is basically connective tissue surrounding the bone, which is very important because this carries the blood vessels and the nerves to the bone tissue. You also have articular surfaces, so where the bones connect to one another, you have their joints, and these joints require an articular surface, and an articular cartilage is covering these surfaces. There are other specific markings on the surface of the bones which are used for the attachment of muscle tendons and ligaments for connecting the bones into joints. If you cut a bone open, then you can see two basic architectural types of bone tissue. You have the compact bone and the spongy or trabecular bone substance. In the example of the head of the femoral bone, this is the bone of the thigh. So you can see this. In the midpiece here, you see two thick layers. So it's cut in a longitudinal section. So this is basically round in shape if you take the complete bone. So here you have the so-called compact or cortical layer. This will be made much thinner in the area of the neck and the head of the femoral bone, and on the inside here you have this bone trabeculae. That's the spongy bone area. The basic idea behind this spongy bone architecture is to how can we achieve maximal strength, maximal stability of the bone with the lowest possible bone weight. In the spongy bone, you also have bone marrow. Bone marrow cavity is just made into smaller pieces, and this is in case of the femoral bone, it is in children, it is red bone marrow, and in adults it is replaced by yellow bone marrow. So in adults there are no red bone marrow anymore, or very minimal, very limited amount of red bone marrow and blood production inside the tubular bones. It is found, so red bone marrow and blood production is found in flat and cuboidal bones only in adults. The medullary cavity of the midpiece surrounded by compact bone is huge, so that's where you have the most amount of bone marrow, and this is in almost all cases yellow bone marrow, so basically general fat tissue. The most important body parts and the bone content is found here in this next slide. So inside the head, which is called caput in Latin, you have the skull, and that is called cranium in Latin. Then you have the neck and the body, where you have the vertebral column, so that is divided into a cervical, a thoracic or thoracal, and a lumbar portion. Then you have the shoulder area or shoulder girdle, which contains two bones, the clavicle and the scapula, and these will be connected to the chest, where you have the thoracic spine, the ribs, which are called costae in Latin, and the chest bone to the front, which is called sternum. In the abdominal area, you only have the lumbar spine as bones, and in the pelvic area, you have the sacrum and the two hip bones. Then, connected to the shoulder girdle, you have the upper limb, which is containing the following bones. In the upper part, you have the humerus. In the forearm, you have two bones, the radius and the ulna, and then you have the bones of the hand. The hand is divided into three main areas. You have the wrist area, which is called the base of the hand, so that's where you have the carpus and the carpal bones. Then you have the palm of the hand, which you call the metacarpal area and metacarpal bones, and then you have the fingers, which are called the digits, and they have phalanx units, so phalangeal units, phalangeal bones inside. The thumb has two phalanges, the other fingers have three pieces each. In the lower limb, it looks similar basically to the upper limb. So you have the thigh, where you have one single huge long bone, that's the femur or femoral bone. Then you have the knee area, where you have an extra bone, which is the patella. Such bone does not exist on the upper limb. Then you have the leg with two bones, the tibia on the inside and the fibula on the outside. And then the foot is essentially similar to the hand. So you have the root, which is the tarsus with tarsal bones. Then you have the main piece of the foot, that's the metatarsus, and 5 pieces of metatarsal bones. And then you have the toes, again digits composed of phalanx units, just like the fingers were. Again, the great toe has 2, and the other 4 toes have 3 pieces of phalanges each. So these were the individual bones. We have to put them together in order to make the skeletal system. So we need to talk about the connections, the possible connections of bones. First of all, you have 2 major types. You have the continuous joints and the so-called discontinuous joints. The continuous joints are called Synarthrosis in Latin. There are 3 main types, depending on what tissue binds the 2 bones. And this tissue has to fill the space in between the 2 connected bones entirely, so there is no gap in between allowed. There is no cavity in between. If this tissue is connective tissue, then you are talking about the fibrous joint, like the sutures of the skull, but there are other examples as well. This is called syndesmosis in Latin. If it is cartilage, so the tissue filling the gap between the bones entirely, then that's synchondrosis, cartilageous joint. Or it's kind of a special case where 2 separately developing bones fuse together and basically they unite, then that is called synostosis or bony joint. A good example for that is the hip bone. Discontinuous or synovial joints, which is called articulation in Latin, these are the connections which can produce movements. So the classification is according to the number of axes along which or around which these joints can produce movements. There are one-axial joints, so one axis, uniaxial. There are 2 types, the hinge and the pivot. The hinge joint can bend and flex and extend as well, so flexed or extended, so bending and stretching. The pivot joint can rotate, so internal rotation, external rotation, or rotate to left, to right. There are biaxial joints with 2 axes. The wrist joint, for instance, is an ellipsoid joint, and the thumb joint, the joint of the thumb, is a saddle joint. There are 2 axes there, so at the same time there can be 2 different directions which can produce movements. And there are multi-axial or ball and socket joints. These are free to move, so they can move not only around 1 or 2 axes, but around many axes in any direction. There are also special cases like combined hinge pivot joints, like the knee and the elbow, where basically you have 2 parts of the joint. One is a hinge and one is a pivot, which will be put together. But this does not make these joints into a true biaxial, because in order to have a true biaxial joint, you have to have 2 different movements in the same part of the joint, which is not the case in combined hinge pivot. There are also restricted free joints, like the knuckles, so the connection between the metacarpal bone and the first phalanx of the fingers, or the metatarsal bones of the foot and the toes. So these can move quite freely in specific directions, but the movements are limited in other directions. So that's what restricted free means. And there are also plane joints, which have basically no movement allowed. This is due to very strict, very tight ligaments, or the shape of the joint does not allow it. So these are actually true synovial joints. They have every component of a true synovial joint, but they are immovable objects. So what are these components of the synovial joint? There are several things which are required in order to form a synovial joint. First of all, you need at least two bones which are connected, and the surface which are connected to one another are called articulating surfaces. These have to be covered by a layer of cartilage tissue. This is the articular cartilage. Then it has to be surrounded, encapsulated by a connective tissue layer, which is the capsule. And also you need to have a joint cavity, which is surrounded by the capsule, and that includes the articular surfaces and covered with the articular cartilage. This capsule has two layers, an outer fibrous layer, which is made of dense connective tissue, and an internal synovial membrane, which is producing synovial fluid, which is found inside the joint cavity. This synovial fluid has a very important function to reduce the friction as the two bones are moving. There are also ligaments which strongly, tightly connect the two bones together, and you also can have some accessory parts like cartilage discs or rings, articular lip, or sac or bursa. Bursa is a small synovial fluid filled structure which is embedded into such spaces where you have ligaments or muscles or tendons of muscles passing through or passing by a bony hard surface in order to reduce the friction and to reduce the risk of injury of that particular structure which the bursa is supporting. Cartilage discs and rings and lips are also associated to some synovial joints. The lip, articular lip, is enlarging the articular surface of one of the connected bones. Rings and discs can even out so-called incongruency. Incongruency means if the two articular surfaces do not match each other perfectly. So you can have such structures associated to joints as well. This here is the example of interphalangeal joint, so between two phalanx bones of the fingers. With this example, we can go through these parts again. So you do have the two bones connecting. Here you have the articular surfaces. This black C-shaped area is the cavity, articular cavity filled with the synovial fluid. Here you see the capsule, which you can see also that it is the continuation of the periosteal layer covering the bone actually. So there is no strict border between the periosteum and the capsule. The picture does not show it, but the capsule should be thicker than the periosteum layer actually is. And then here, starting from the articular surface is covered with cartilage, so that's where you have this green or grayish layer. That's the synovial membrane producing the synovial fluid. In a lot of the joints, you consider a male part of the joint, so one of the articular surfaces is considered the male part and the other one is considered the female part, but that does not apply to all of the joints. Okay, let's talk about movements. So joints can produce movements. What are the terms to describe movements? So flexion and extension. So stretching is extension, so stretching out like the elbow, and bending or flexing, that's flexion. Adduction and abduction. Only one letter difference, but these are opposite movements. Adduction, AD, means moving towards the body. Abduction, so abduction, means moving away from the body. And rotation can be internal rotation and external rotation. These different movements are produced along different axes. Usually flexion and extension is performed around a transverse axis. Abduction, adduction usually uses a sagittal axis, and rotation should use a longitudinal axis. And you also can have the combination of these different movements in case of multi-axial, so ball and socket joints. This concludes the first part of the lecture. Then let's move on to the second part, which will cover muscles, so the active components of movements. There can be three main histologic types of muscles. You can have skeletal muscle, you can have cardiac muscle, you can have smooth muscle. In this lecture, we are going to talk about skeletal muscles exclusively. So the muscle system is composed basically of these skeletal muscles, which is histologically a striated muscle. This will be covered in detail in later lectures. So they are the active components of the movements, and the basic function of these muscle tissues is the contraction. This is the term which we describe shortening with. Also, skeletal muscles are able to determine the shape of the body, and they are attaching to the skeletal system, so they are moving bones and joints. Muscles of the internal organs can make muscular wall of organs and sphincter muscles. The reason why this is included in the slide is that because sometimes striated skeletal muscle can also be involved in the formation of muscles of internal organs. So the general rules of skeletal muscle formation composition. First of all, each and every muscle in itself is a separate organ of the human body. This means that it is also a structural and a functional unit as well. But according to anatomical relations, so found on the same area of the body, and function, they can be put into muscle groups. Each of these muscle groups has a connective tissue layer encapsulating it, and inside each and every individual muscle has also such an encapsulating connective tissue. This is called the fascia. So the fascia is the connective tissue encapsulating each and every muscle, and larger areas, larger, thicker layers of fascia are encapsulating muscle groups and separate muscle groups from one another. So this connective tissue, the fascia, and the bone to which the muscles and the muscle groups are attached to are forming the so-called osteofibrous compartments. This is extremely important for understanding the human anatomy, and also it is extremely important to understand several conditions, medical conditions, which can result from muscle damage or bone fracture. Compartment syndrome means that if there is tissue damage in a specific muscle area, it's much more common in the lower leg since the fascia is stronger. So if you have muscle tissue damage, the tissue responds to this injury with swelling, which will increase pressure, and this increased pressure will compromise the blood supply of the muscle tissue, worsening the situation. So a vicious cycle is starting where tissue damage will result in increased pressure will reduce blood supply will cause tissue damage further. Tendons. Tendons are the organs which are associated to muscles to conduct the force of the muscle onto the bone. These are made of dense connective tissue. And the muscle belly is made of the actual muscle tissue plus a connective tissue framework as basis, which will continue into the tendon at the end of the muscle belly. So in this picture, let's quickly summarize these informations again. So here you have one bone, here you have the other bone. One tendon is fixed to one of the bones. This is considered the origin if this is not moved or moved less compared to the other end, which is the insertion or called the mobile point. which will be moved, and if the muscle is contracting, shortening, this point will be pulled in this direction towards the origin point. So generally speaking, the muscle's origin is the bone which is moved less or not at all when the muscle is shortened, and the insertion is the part which is moved, so that's the mobile point. At both ends you have the tendon attached to the bone surface, and in between here you have the belly of the muscle, which in Latin is called venter, and here you see the fascia covering the muscle. On this side, this fascia is not shown, so it is removed. According to the belly shape, you can have several types of muscles. First of all, the most basic is the round-shaped muscle belly. These are called the fusiform muscles. You can also have flat muscles like the muscles of the abdominal wall. These muscles should also have a flattened tendon, which is no longer called a tendon. Instead, the term aponeurosis is introduced to describe these structures. So flat tendon is an aponeurosis. If a muscle has more than one origin, then that's called a multi-headed muscle, so biceps muscle with 2 heads, triceps, quadriceps, 3 and 4 heads respectively. If it has more than one belly, so an inserted middle tendon is separating the muscle belly into 2 or more parts, then you call such a muscle a biventer with 2 bellies or multiventer muscles. These are rare but occur in the human body. And you also have feather-shaped or pennatus muscles. This picture is actually showing a bipennatus muscle, so twice-feathered muscle, where the tendon is not just starting here at the end of the muscle belly, but in the middle of the muscle belly, and the muscle fibers go to this middle tendon in an oblique fashion. Feather-shaped muscles can increase the strength of their contraction, but they are sacrificing the length of contraction, so the length of the extent of the movement for this increased strength. Function of muscles. So the muscles are doing contraction. This can result in shortening, so production of actual movement, or just increasing the tension of the muscle. The resting state tension of the muscle is considered the muscle tone. This is required to stabilize your body position or posture. Another important aspect is the term antagonistic and agonistic muscles. This refers somewhat to muscle groups. So agonistic muscles are the ones which work together, so move the same joint into the same direction. And antagonistic means that they are having opposite function. So one is flexing, the other one is extending the same joint. In this case, they are working as antagonists. Innervation. So the function of muscles is regulated by the nervous system. How these nerves are influencing the function of the muscle, that is called innervation. So the motor nerve is the nerve which is responsible for the volunteer function, volunteer movement of that particular muscle. Here the transmitter, so the signaling molecule which is released by the nerve endings, is acetylcholine. This is extremely important to know. Motor unit. Motor unit describes how much muscle tissue, how much muscle fibers are innervated by one nerve fiber. So how much muscle is associated to one single nerve piece. This will determine the possible precision of the movements. If you have lots of nerves innervating one muscle piece, then obviously these motor units are smaller and the precision is increased. On the contrary, if you have several nerve fibers for a large muscle mass, then you can't have such a precise movement coordination in that particular muscle. Obviously, there are some muscles which require large amount of motor units which are very precisely regulated, others are not that much. And you also have special structures to mitigate the friction, mostly of tendons. These are bursas and also tendon sheets are associated to several tendons. These will reduce the risk of damage of these particular muscles or tendons. Thank you very much.